hadn't had his productive day either. He had slept heavily for the entire first night back in his own bed, and hadn't woken up till noon. At first, he had been disoriented. He thought that he was still in the shed, and he thought he overslept and missed the opportunity to stare at the closet door for hours. But as the truth had reached him, that he was safe and sound back in his own home, he had been able to relax and close his eyes again. Then he used the next 30 minutes to wake up properly. Before he dragged himself out into the living room and onto his sofa, he's still wrapped up in his bed covers, but with his glasses on, no headache in the slate today. He made himself a cup of tea and was finished up on the sofa. Under his covers in front of the TV, at around 1:30, he had gone back to sleep. The clock turned 3 and Randall was fast asleep on the sofa, cuddled up in the covers on his bed. His black framed glasses were half on, and he held the remote and control in his hand as the TV was on, and at that moment it was airing a talk show featuring a middle-aged monsters arguing about their children's welfare. Just as the host of the talk show welcomed the children's questioned the grandmothers up on stage, there was a sound coming from all outside Randall's apartment. Randall rolled over, but he didn't wake up. Then there was another sound. The sound of a door being unlocked and opened. Randall was still sleeping, face down on the sofa cushion, body tightly wrapped up in the covers, as if he was walking inside of a cocoon. Then there was a sound of a door being shut that woke Randall up. Despite him being tired and confused and more disoriented he had been a couple of hours ago, and he quickly managed to turn off the TV and camouflaged and removed his glasses. He then realized that he didn't have the time to put on the bed covers back in his bedroom, so he climbed onto the wall and the corners and the ceiling instead. He had no idea who it was that just entered his home, but he was not going to be spotted. He held his breath and waited for the intruders to enter the living room, and trying to figure out what to do when they did. When Randall saw the two monsters walking through the door, he almost forgot that he had kept himself hidden. He had to hold back a gasp of a couple of swear words, and his chin dropped to the closet in his chest. What the hell were Sullivan and Sophie doing in his apartment? And why the hell were they together? After a couple of minutes filled the shock with anger of seeing his sister and rival together in his home, Randall figured out that Sophie had to be there because she was probably the new owner of the place now, and that he had thought about just yesterday. But what about the big day? The hairy baboon? Why was she there? It's so dark, Sophie said, carefully placing the cardboard box containing Randall's possessions from his Monsters Inc. locker on the floor, opening the lid, as if she was going to put the contents back in the right places from the ceiling. Randall could notice this and recognize some of his belongings in the box. He felt sick as he pictured Sullivan and Sophie, maybe even Wazowski, going through his personal stuff, placing them there. "Do you mind opening the curtains, Mr. Sullivan?" Sophie continued, as she let go of the box and pointed at the window. "Look, Sophie, I told you, it's silly." The hairy monster went over to the windows and gently removed the curtains, allowing the sunlight to enter the room. Randall felt as if he was blinded all of a sudden by a slight setting. Also, the lights shone through all the dust that had been gathered in the apartment over the last month. That made Randall even more worse than before. He hated it when his home was messy. "He did used to sleep on this couch?" Sully nodded towards the bed sheets on the sofa. Randall hated the fact that Sullivan was there to see his home was in state. He didn't want him to hear no matter what happens and what his apartment will look like. But when it looked like it was an extra humiliated. "I don't think so," Sophie answered. "He was a very tidy guy. It's not like him to leave his place like this." "Well, like I've said before, he's probably wasn't in his right mind at the end. This proves it." Sully's words came out slowly, as if he hesitated. Randall rolled his eyes, and then a long period of silence between Sophie and Sully, and Randall was afraid that they'd rather hear him breathe. "I'm sorry, Sophie." Sophie's words just came out of surprise both Randall and Sully, and Sully's answer to them was exactly what Randall's mind had to do. "What? On the behalf of my brother, I'm sorry." Sully didn't know what to answer to that, so he just nodded his head, and Randall felt like throwing up. Randall wasn't really a bad person. Sophie didn't take a look directly at Sully, but he had his issues. "I know this because it probably sounds weird, but please don't hate him." A new pause. Randall had kept himself from strangling his sister. I don't hate him. Sully didn't know if he was just saying to comfort Sophie, but there was a bit of truth to it. He didn't exactly was been best friends with Randall, but he had never thought that he hated him. In an attempt to change the subject, he asked Sophie a question. So, what are you planning to do along with the apartment? Do you want to pull out the safe? Randall sharpened his ears. He was excited to hear about this one. I don't think I want to sell it, Sophie said as a moment came through. I could rent it out, and maybe Rex can live in here when he grows up. Who's Rex? Sully didn't want to ask her another question right away, but this one simply dropped out of his mouth. He's my son, Sophie explained, and Sully noticed how her whole face lit up as soon as she mentioned her boy. He turns 4 in August, and you know what? He actually had his first day at day scare at Monsters Inc. yesterday. When I went back to work, he seemed very pleased. You have a son? Sully was surprised. I didn't even know you were married. I'm not, Sophie smiled at him. Then she moved Randall's bed covers and sat herself on the sofa, and patted her hand towards the spot next to an invitation for Sully to sit too. He sat down, and Randall noticed how he leaned on the pillow away from his bed. That caused him to feel nausea coming up his way again. I guess I never was either, Sophie continued. Rex's father and I spent some time together, but we never talked about making things too serious. But then Rex came along, and then things suddenly got serious anyway. His father and I tried to make it work for Rex's sake, but things were too different, and therefore we split up. When Rex was a baby, he was completely out of the picture, so Rex didn't even know him. I'm sorry. Sully was clearly uncomfortable. Try not to look at Sophie. His eyes landed on the one place on the ceiling where Randall was hiding. The purple lizard held his breath. Don't be. It's all right. Sophie's voice made Sully calm down. He dared her to do the face again, and that caused Randall to relax a bit too. At least he was dared to breathe again, and he was hoping that the conversation was over by now. But no way, things just got started. Wow, Sully continued, eager to learn more about Sophie and Rex. And Randall, a son, hey? Randall never told me anyone that he had a nephew. He never cared about him, Sophie said. In fact, I saw him more as a rival. A rival? Sully could hardly believe his eyes and ears what he's hearing. How can the grown monster possibly see a little boy as his rival? Please don't judge him. Sophie was still speaking at the same time, calm voice that made Sully feel so good. Randall's been through a lot. It hasn't been easy for him, and I didn't think I'd say that he hates Rex or anything. He's just not uncle material. Sully then started, what kind of a person is Randall, and he was to view his own 3-year-old nephew and a rival not care about him? Was he completely heartless? Sophie, as if she was able to read Sully's mind, continued. I'm a lot older than Randall, 10 years to be precise. When he was born, I had been dreaming about getting a brother or sister in my life. I was thrilled when I finally got one. And he was such a cute baby. Randall was still camouflaged in the ceiling, wanted to punch something. Sophie went on. I took my role as a big sister very seriously. I helped my parents take care of Randall, played with him, and read him stories. If he was picked on, I stood up for him. We shared secrets and developed a wonderful relationship. So what happened? Sully didn't control his curiosity any longer and just needed to give his questions. When Randall was 8, Sophie continued, he went with Mom and Dad to visit our grandparents over the weekend. I stayed at home. I was 18, and I would rather stay home with my friends, you know, how teenagers like to be. Sully just nodded, remembering himself as an 18-year-old. Well, Sophie's face gained a little more serious look. They were supposed to get home on Sunday night, but that never happened. It was late in autumn and the roads were icy. When they drove through a turn, the car lost its grip and they drove off the road. Sully sat completely stilled, eyes wide and listened. Randall was looking at the other direction. Our parents died at the scene, Sophie spoke slowly, as if she relived everything, and Randall was badly injured. He was hospitalized more than a month, and I was there for him every day. They said his chances were small, but they thought he wouldn't make it through it, but he's a fighter. He always has been. Sully felt silent. He thought he would never guess. Randall, a little boy, seriously injured, orphan. This was just so tragic. If he had known before. Randall was still watching the scene as he hated the compassionate, soft look on Sully's face more than anything else in the world at the moment. The last thing he wanted was pity, especially from his rival. Well, after a short break, Sophie continued the Boggs family story. When Randall got out of the hospital, I was given custody to him, and I was only 18 at the moment. Remember, and well, things weren't going very well to start with. And I thought you said that you and Randall had a good relationship, Sully asked. We did, but Randall changed after the accident, Sophie explained. He became silent and anxious, just fell behind in school, and almost lost all of his friends. He cried himself to sleep almost every night, but he never allowed me to comfort him or even talk to him about it. He just wanted Mom and Dad back. I didn't know what to do for him. I just felt so helpless. At one point, he even said that he wished he died in the accident too. Can you imagine hearing something like that coming from an 8-year-old? Randall hung his head. How could he be wishing Sophie died in the accident? Listening to this was pure torture. So what happened further? Sully asked, and found himself generally interested in more of Sophie's story. He didn't want to even think about the questions over. He just wanted the answers. It got better. Sophie smiled again. For the first time, what had been felt like hours. Then there was this one night, 5 or 6 months after the accident, when there was a thunderstorm and a blackout in the city. I was in the middle of the night, and I was actually sleeping despite the terrible noise, when Randall suddenly woke me up. He entered my bedroom, and he was crying his eyes out. He had been always afraid of thunder. Randall rolled his eyes. He wasn't afraid of thunder. When Mom and Dad were alive, they used to cradle him and comfort him when he was scared. By the time they weren't around to do so, like I said, he came into the room instead, scared to death. So I lifted him up in my bed and tucked him in with me and allowed him to stay there for the night. By now, Sophie's eyes had gotten somewhat the same glow. They have come a long way when she had first mentioned Rex to Sully, and she went on. Dawn. When I woke up the next morning, Randall was asleep. 2 of his hands were holding up to me, and the look on his face was so incredibly peaceful. I've never wanted anything like it. I even slept for another couple hours, as if it slept off the bad feelings off that night. And I just laid there right next to him, silently watching, afraid to disturb him. When he finally woke up, we made ourselves some breakfast, and then we just stayed inside the entire day, listening to the rain on the windows, as we read, talked, played, and board games, and all the candles were lit around us. It was wonderful. So then everything went back to normal? Sully didn't quite understand. That didn't make sense. How could a sweet little Randall sleep with his big sister? His bed possibly would have ended there if it was ruthless bastard who would have been chasing him around the factory a month ago. Not entirely, Sophie admitted. Randall still doesn't socialize very well, and became very dependent on me. He was silent and shy, and afraid to bond with the other monsters. I guessed he was scared that he would lose them again. Maybe he still is, Sully thought to himself. He had never seen Randall with any friends. Sophie continued to her story. I tried to arrange play dates for him, but he always wanted me to go with him. So when he got wimpy child nobody wanted to play with because he always brought his sister along, it stayed like that way through elementary school, and didn't get more popular as he grew older. He was so lonely, and so it was truly painful for me to just watch. He was just a sweet guy, and all he wanted was friends, but his shyness of fearing of bonding always got in his way. Nobody ever fully got to know him. Randall wanted to sneak out of the living room. This conversation made him feel sick. However, he was still in the corner, surrounded by 2 monsters that he hated, and if he did try to get out, his sister or that big hairy clown would probably hear him. He didn't even want to use his hands to cover his ears. He just needed 4 of them just to hold on to the ceiling, and all he could do was pray the nightmare would be over soon. That sounds like Randall and I met in college, Sully said eventually, as if to confirm Sophie's last utterance. He has changed drastically in college, Sophie's show followed up, but before we went there, he had all talked about how much he wanted to be a fresh start. Nobody there he knew from his past. He would finally get his friends to go to parties and all the things he do normal teenagers take for granted. And when he came home from Christmas, he told me that he had been accepted into an exclusive fraternity. However, he didn't want to talk much about it. I have a feeling that people are probably hung up with the bad influence on him. Sully could have told her that himself. When he went back to the spring semester, Sophie continued, he was eager to participate in the annual scare games. He went on about how much he would be his school's top scarer, and he helped his friends get home safely to see the trophy. but all we got to know what went on, did we? Sophie looked at Sully, who turned to his red underfur. Yes, that's right, she said. His team would have been started the runner-ups, and he made a fool of himself. I've been told that I've tried to scare when the skin-covered pink hearts, and he got, fall caused by, Sully looked down at Sophie and continued. He was so devastated when I heard he got kicked out of his frantically. I was seriously starting to worry about him. However, he never talked about quitting school. He just never came in even more eager to become the greatest scarer ever, and he graduated with good results, but not the best. Still the runner-up. Sully then started to see a pattern. Then he got the dream job at Monsters, Inc. He was more determined than ever before to become the best. However, he became the runner-up again. To you this time. Sully said. It was all he could think about was accept another apology. He had felt and used the card a couple of times, too many already today. Randall then had a headache. It lifted his entire head, and he tried to push everything else out. Maybe, but that was why he had to hold back a tear. It made him feel so angry. So that's Randall, Sophie sounded as she was about to reach conclusion. Always the runner-up, never the best. Sully then just looked at her. Randall wanted to scream. At the moment of silence followed to Randall, it seemed to be like forever. When Sully spoke again, it was in a half an hour past. But what was that about the whole nephew-rival thing? Sully still couldn't see how Randall would possibly dislike his own nephew. Before I got Rex, Sophie spoke quietly, Randall was the only family I had left. He was number one to me, and when I had my son, he became more obvious number one. He indeed then needed me more than anyone, even Randall, so I think Randall dislikes Rex because he sees him as the person who made him the runner-up again. Rex made Randall the second one next in line in my heart. Randall had never seen an expression of more sympathy than Sullivan did at this point. He hated it. He just hated it as much as he hated his sister. More than an hour passed since Sully and Sophie left Randall's apartment. Their words were still ringing in Randall's ears, and straightforward terrible. He tried his best to not think about the things that had been said between the two, but he could not escape it, so he didn't even know what was the worst part to come. He had just reminded himself of every single day the part of his miserable life, or his sister that had shared his entire life story with Sullivan. His mind, he could still picture the stupid look in Sullivan's eyes when Sophie told him the whole story, and he hated it. Just the idea of Sullivan feeling sorry for him made him nauseous again. The headache was on its way once more, and Randall was back on the sofa, under his covers, and he didn't feel like eating. He probably didn't have any fresh fruit in his house anyway. He wondered how he was going to get his groceries, even though he had to stay hidden. But he decided he'll think it over tomorrow. He was too depressed and tired right away, and he did really wanted to do is relaxed. He turned on the TV back on and sit over the corner and roll over on the screen. He went back to sleep.